Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 981, Old Enemy. Northern gripped the airship's wheel, guiding it through the dark clouds at breathtaking speed. He could control the vessel with mere thought. His mind linked directly to the tower, but where was the joy in that? Playing air sailor felt infinitely better. The clouds parted as they surged forward. Northern spotted the Academy's island in the distance, wrapped in a crimson shroud that twisted like smoke. The ominous sight made his chest tighten. Others couldn't see what he saw, of course. He had special eyes. Instructors stood scattered across the deck, shoulders rigid with tension. Student council members took positions at different corners, their faces carved from stone. Even with the tower's incredible speed, Northern figured they needed several dozen minutes before reaching the Academy. The journey used to take nearly a full day by conventional flight. The tower's unmatched velocity helped tremendously, but limits existed. The island sat far from Variolania, across the continent from Riamgard, which controlled the seas connecting the northern and eastern continents to the central plains. This location also bordered the Protector's Barrier, the ice wall formed by Ruffsberg that shielded the continent from the monsters lurking in the dark continent and the treacherous waters beyond. Northern stared ahead, his expression sharp with focus. Footsteps approached from behind. A young woman with short white hair paused beside him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Hey!" Northern's gaze lingered on the horizon before he turned, blinking as if surfacing from deep water. "Oh, hey. Hi." Nasira tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her smile soft but fragile. "I never said, thank you for saving me." Northern's laugh came short and easy. "You don't need to. I'd have done that for anyone. It's not duty. I'm just learning that if I can do something, I should." Nasira studied him for several heartbeats, then looked down, still smiling. "That's a wonderful lesson. But sometimes don't we get trapped? By morals, responsibilities, the weight of our choices, what those consequences might cost us." Northern's face scrunched as the words hit him. He'd barely figured out one truth, and now another wall rose to block his path. Silence stretched between them. He wrestled with her question, turning it over like a puzzle piece that wouldn't fit. Finally, he sighed. "You know what? I'll worry about that later. At least I'll know I did what felt right." She blinked, surprise lighting her features. "You're quite the simpleton, aren't you?" Northern's frown came swift and sharp. "Watch how you use that word. Someone else might take it wrong. They could get hurt." Color flooded Nasira's cheeks. She stepped back, hands fluttering. "Ah, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean." Northern's smile cut through her panic like sunlight breaking clouds. The expression transformed his face completely. His white hair caught the night's subtle glow, seeming to shimmer with its own light. His blue eyes sparkled with warmth, the whole effect achingly beautiful, almost angelic. Nasira fell silent, her breath catching in her throat. Northern's grin lingered after his brief smile. "I was joking with you, or maybe not. Either way, it's fine by me." She stared at him for a long moment, lost in thought, before snapping back to reality. Yes." Northern watched her with raised eyebrows, then slowly shook his head. More footsteps approached. Ellis nodded respectfully to the young lady before taking his place beside Northern, silence stretching between them. Northern glanced at the lean boy, noting his dark eyes, surprisingly tender for someone so guarded. He grinned. "I heard you cried. Did you really think I'd die that easily?" Ellis chuckled, crossing his arms. "Of course not. Why would I waste precious tears on some clones?" His frown appeared almost instantly. "But since when can you use clones?" Nasira had drifted away by now, positioning herself at the ship's opposite edge to stare into the dark horizon. Northern shrugged. I've always been able to use clones. Ellis's jaw dropped. What? Really? He counted on his fingers. You can tame monsters, you're incredibly fast, you can control fire and ice, you're stronger than anyone, and you can fly. Where did all this come from? What exactly is your talent? Northern's grin widened as he looked at his friend. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Ellis's expression hardened. Try me. Northern studied him carefully, then smiled and faced forward. After a moment, his voice cut through the space between them, barely above a whisper. I can permanently copy people's talents. Ellis stared at him with a blank expression. Northern glanced sideways to gauge his friend's reaction. The guy just stood there, eyes unchanged, completely unmoved. He'd expected something more dramatic. Ellis exhaled and scratched his head. Well, I wasn't really expecting you to tell me your talent anyway. I get why people guard that information, and I won't ask you to do something you don't want to. I'm only asking because I thought maybe we were close enough, you know. You didn't have to lie if you didn't want to share. Northern faced forward and sighed, his eyes drooping halfway in a lazy, tired expression. What was I expecting? Ellis frowned and started to turn away when he suddenly froze. Northern's eyes widened at the same instant. He lunged for the wheel, spinning it with terrifying speed. The ship's bow swung hard to the side. A heartbeat later, barely that, another vessel crashed into them. This ship, crafted from strange dark and crimson alloy, shattered the concrete around their bow region like glass. The metal ship drove forward with relentless force. It bore an eerie resemblance to Northern's vessel, only this one radiated menace. On its deck sat a black and red pagoda, twisted and ominous against the night sky. The pagoda bore a crimson door, and before it stood a man draped in black garments that hung loose around his frame. Other figures in dark clothing worked the ship's controls while more brandished curved swords and wicked weapons. Their faces turned rigid, their muscles coiled like springs ready to strike. Northern studied the attackers for several heartbeats. Then his expression darkened. He recognized them all, especially the man. That crafty bastard who'd slipped through his fingers when hijackers attacked his ship bound for Arcadia. A grin split Northern's face despite the danger. Damn! I was really hoping he'd show up when I could actually copy that talent of his. Chapter 982. Reunion. The 9 instructors moved toward the ship's edge, their fists opening as sparks danced around their hands. The sparks twisted into weapons, some familiar, others strange. One instructor summoned what looked like a stone book, its pages glowing with ancient power. The students stepped forward, hands opening in response. The scar-faced instructor glanced back at them, his voice cutting through the tension. You kids stay back. Let the adults handle this. Shay hesitated, then stepped back. The others followed his lead. But Nasira was already caught in the chaos. Shay's frown deepened as he stepped forward. I'm sorry, I can't. Something slammed into his skull. His vision spun as his head cracked against the concrete deck. Irwin! The pink-haired girl's scream tore through the air. She lunged forward, fury blazing in her eyes. The scar-faced instructor stood unmoved, as if his hand hadn't just crushed the vice president of the student council. His same hand whipped out and seized her throat. He stepped forward and slammed her to the ground. I said, let the adults take care of it. He raised his head to the other students, his eyes gleaming with cold malice. Meanwhile, at the ship's bow, hijackers from the enemy vessel soared through the air and landed on Northern's deck. The Citadel representatives, Helena, Celis, and Vector, waited for them. As the invaders touched down, the 3 shot forward. The instructors moved too, clashing with enemies climbing up from below. Another ship lurked beneath them. Anchors tore through the clouds, hooking the airship like claws. Nasira stood without her hammer, but a massive greatsword materialized in her grip. She swayed slightly, finding her balance, then swung the blade over her back before slashing at the first attacker who lunged at her. Northern was already airborne. He landed hard on his invader's metal fortress, studying the lead figure with sharp eyes. A smile crept across his lips. I had my doubts. Even though I didn't get a clear look at your face last time, your build, your stance, your presence. It's all the same. The smile widened into a dangerous grin. The last encounter wasn't enough for you, was it? You want more. This time, I hope you brought more than one clone. The man stayed silent, his expression dark and twisted with disgust. Northern raised his brows, alert to the shift. What's that look? Are you angry? The man's brows creased. Then he raised his hand slowly. Darkness swirled in his palm. I learned much from you, last time, and I prepared thoroughly to meet you again. Northern's smile widened. Oh? Show me what you've got. The two moved. Northern streaked forward like sharp azure light. The man moved differently, seemingly slow but untouchable, even by the wind itself. He vanished in a swirl of black mist. Both warriors clashed, metal screaming against metal in a deafening roar. The air itself trembled, the wind cowering before the pressure they unleashed. The man's face remained cold and disgusted as he pulled his sword back and struck again with brutal speed. Northern blocked easily, his grin widening. The man's second hand moved. Darkness swirled into his palm, and a curved black stiletto dropped toward Northern as he spoke in measured tones. I have studied you. The dagger stopped midair before Northern. He shoved the other sword aside and grinned. Oh! The invader's dark frown deepened. You can read combat styles, can't you? Plus you have that impenetrable defense. He twirled his sword. But here's the thing about talents, boy. Nothing is truly impenetrable. Every talent has its weakness. Northern's smile sharpened. I guess you'll be looking a whole lot today. He shot forward and met the man again. The air shuddered under the weight of their blades kissing harshly. Illusion Hefter sang its cold, silent song of death. The man's sword was formidable, either legendary or ancient grade. Something crafted from leviathan skin or belial bone. Northern's silver blade struggled and vibrated with each clash. The black sword was much thicker than Illusion Hefter, ominous in both look and feel. It carried a subtle mist of darkness that stained the air around it. The dagger was equally sinister, but Northern used his void force as a shield to handle that threat. He blocked another strike and staggered back, his hand ringing from the impact. The sinister man gritted his teeth and glared. Are you not taking this seriously? Northern smiled as he examined his sword for a moment. Then he looked at the man. Let's just say I'm gauging you. He paused, catching his breath. I think I don't really need a sword to defeat you. Northern released his grip, letting his sword dissolve into sparks. The man stared at him, face twisting in disgust. How dare you? Northern shrugged. You studied me, didn't you? Figured out my weaknesses and all that. Northern scoffed. I didn't even use a single talent when I was fighting you. The man's expression darkened further. Bluffs. Oh? Call this bluff then. Northern swung one hand casually. The man's eyes widened. A terrible gust of wind passed through him, though he couldn't tell what it was. An ominous feeling filled the air, as if the space around him had sharpened into invisible blades. A moment later, a white line appeared across the pagoda perched atop his metal vessel's deck. His eyes went wide as he whipped his head back. The clean slice had cut the building in half, and the upper section was sliding downward. It crashed onto the rear deck with a thunderous groan that shook the entire ship. The severed building tumbled over the rim and rolled off the vessel, vanishing slowly into the clouds below. The man stared with wide eyes. His calmness and disgust vanished, replaced by shock and mounting fear. How? Northern watched him with a crooked grin. Don't judge me with yesterday's eyes. You're going to regret it. Chapter 983, Overpowered. Northern glided through the air on his way to Variolania, already busy with tasks that mainly involved checking his profile and evolving the only talent he'd left untouched. Because of that, Whispering Gale had gained 5 incredible talent abilities. Wind Blade, Wind Compass, wind embrace, windlass, and wind manipulation. But that wasn't the most incredible thing about the new talent abilities. The most incredible thing was the fact that Whispering Gale had evolved into a talent that could now damage the soul. Wind Blade, for example, could cut the physical, but Northern could also make it slice through things without form, including one's soul. Wind Compass detected presence based on one's soul. Wind Embrace allowed him to merge with the wind itself, becoming invisible. With Windlass, he could erase the wind in a particular area, and Wind Manipulation, that one spoke for itself. So the act of simply cutting down the pagoda wasn't something that came out of nowhere. There was a reason he had targeted the pagoda. Northern had something to achieve in doing so. The answer was simple: fear. He wanted the strange man to start fearing him, to realize there was no way he could have ever truly understood him. He thought he had studied Northern? Northern wanted him to understand that he hadn't even glimpsed 1% of what he was capable of. He did feel a bit twisted for wanting such a thing, but only for a moment. Watching the man's expression slowly crumble now filled him with satisfaction. A smile slowly spread across his face. I think I'm just gonna keep doing everything I want to do. The feeling was seriously intoxicating. Either way, he looked at the man and spoke dryly, placing both hands behind his back. There was something about him that no longer seemed like that of a young man, let alone a teenage boy. So, you were saying? Northern paused, watching him with a crooked smile. You studied me? Northern raised his hands. The wind began to grow cold. Stars of snow began to fall from the clouds. You saw this coming? You studied it? He dropped his hands and the air turned scorching hot, making the man sweat. The heat clung to him like a second skin. Oh, guess you studied this one too. He paused, tapping his chin thoughtfully. Since you studied it all, I wonder if I have any new tricks to use on you. At this point, the man was visibly shaking. The confident and irritated look on his face had vanished. Before, he'd looked quite superior. Now he looked pale, eyes wide and trembling. It was hard to place him in any category. He was scared while trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Northern looked down for a moment, his expression turning somber. Stars. Even I sometimes forget how talented I am, you know? There's no way you could have studied it all. He exhaled and stared directly into the man's eyes, as if piercing into his soul, while grinning wickedly. So, what's it gonna be, invader? Should we fight? Or do you think you could call back your men and surrender? You're fighting a losing battle anyway. The man seemed to sink deeper into fear for a moment, then suddenly glared at him. Surrender? Surrender? That's not even a question. If I fight you I might die, if I don't fight you I will die, either by your hands or his hands. All of you evil men will kill me anyway. You'll never let me be. Northern raised a brow, curious at his words. He sighed and shook his head slightly. Young man, I'm not going to kill you. But yes, I can't have you running around. Instead, what I do is turn my prisoners into minors. Both those that are killed by me and those that aren't. Northern looked intently at him. So if you really decide to surrender, you're definitely not going to die. The man looked at him strangely, contemplative. But there was reluctance in his eyes. That was all Northern needed. Your ability is cloning, isn't it? He smiled knowingly. I'm curious how it works. I can do something similar too, but mine is much better. As Northern finished talking, a perfect clone of himself appeared right next to him. The man froze, his eyes slowly widening even more, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. How? Northern shrugged. They say there are no two identical talents in this world. But you know, I don't believe that. I feel glad, suddenly finding out that someone else has a talent like mine. Honestly, I want to steal it. But I have a feeling that yours works in a very twisted manner. Northern glanced around. All these minions of yours. They are you, aren't they? Northern nodded. Been checking their souls since you got here. They're just like you. Their presence is just like yours. So I figured your cloning works differently. Malicious, in fact, but I don't know yet. I also can't see it, which means, Call did whatever he did to himself to you. Northern's face darkened. Who are you? The man's expression seemed indifferent. He looked away for a bit, a strange expression climbing his face. Then he returned his gaze to Northern with a defiant frown. You don't need to know anything. There's nothing you can do. Northern sighed and looked at the man. I offered you my help already. Would you rather take mine or be killed? The man frowned, slowly raising his sword. You're speaking nonsense. Northern shrugged. At least the nonsense will save your life. Or take it. Northern looked at him again. The decision is really in your hands. But just know, there are plenty of ways for me to stop you. For example, Northern snapped his fingers. Barely a moment later, the people in black clothing suddenly stopped. All of them frozen in movement so that the instructors and others who were fighting them, even though they were already winning, had the chance to rain down blows upon them before discovering that something was wrong. They stopped and watched carefully. Then all of them showed shock as they saw the invaders slowly start to fade, first into blood. Then the blood began to evaporate. Chapter 984. The Traitor. Chaos erupted across the deck. Too many things crashed together at once. No one had time to watch anyone else. The invaders swarmed like ants. 10 times the number of instructors, representatives, and students combined. Bodies pressed against bodies. Human cries tangled with the sharp ring of clashing blades. At the rear, Instructor Stevane held the line. The man was a fortress. Someone every instructor respected. Someone they could trust with their backs. His years spoke for him. Over 10 as senior instructor, countless more as junior. Scars mapped his service. The jagged mark across his face told its own story. 7 years back, during the Milwa Festival, he'd thrown himself between students and a monster's fury. The scar remained, but so did the students. Everyone knew Stevane. Steady, silent, perfect in character. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. Kind to his core, obedient to duty. Which made the scene behind him all the more impossible. The student council lay scattered around his feet. Unconscious, broken, all except Nasira. She remained far beyond his reach, and honestly Stevane felt grateful for that small mercy. The foreigner was the only person he wasn't certain he could drop without raising hell. He stepped away from the fallen students, his boots silent on the deck. A dark frown carved itself across his weathered face as he stared forward. The invaders were fading, vanishing into streams of blood and evaporating. What is going on? The words escaped him as he turned toward the other airship. From his position near the tower entrance, at the rim of the rear deck, he had a clear view of everything. His expression darkened further. The white-haired boy faced off against the other man, alone and exposed. That fool! The words barely left his lips before he melted into the air itself. Only then did the instructors and everyone else begin their retreat. Still shocked, still lost. Their enemy had simply disappeared. Helena's frown deepened as she stared at the distant ship. Isn't that? Celis followed her gaze to the metallic vessel. Isn't that man with us? Then Ellis glanced back, his eyes widened and pale. I think you all need to turn around. They all slowly turned, and their expression became grim and dark. Less than a minute earlier, Northern had waited for the man to recover from his shock. Absolute Lock had seized the man's talent ability, and the effect showed. He probably tried activating it again and again, failing each time. His surprised expression grew paler by the second. Then someone appeared behind him. A hand touched his shoulder. The man's entire body trembled. The fear Northern had been slowly building suddenly exploded, magnified by that single touch. Northern's frown deepened. The person's identity made it worse. He knew this instructor well. The man stayed close to Professor Heimberger, the same person the professor had sent to watch him. Could this mean? Northern shook his head, subtle but firm. No, it wouldn't be. Northern stayed silent, watching the instructor's next move. The man he'd been fighting trembled, words stumbling over themselves. Listen, I. Get out of here. The instructor's shove sent the man flying. One sharp moment, a blur of motion, and the guy crashed into the ship's rear like discarded cargo. The instructor turned to Northern, his expression flat as stone. You really are persistent, aren't you? Northern met his gaze with equal coldness, a dangerous light flickering in his eyes' depths. What's that got to do with you? He paused, then pressed forward. You finally decided to show yourself? Who are you? What's your real name? I know you're working with Call. The man began rolling up his sleeves, slow and deliberate. Call. Right, that strange abomination. Well, one could say we've temporarily teamed up with him to reach our goal. But don't look at me like I'm his lackey. We're merely partners who will gain different things from the same act. Northern's frown deepened. How will releasing an origin, one sealed for good reason, benefit you? The smile that spread across the man's scarred, stone-hard face was grotesque, terrifying, because it will mark the beginning of death for this forsaken world. And with that beginning, my people will rise again, stronger than ever before. With that sacrifice, we shall reclaim what was rightfully ours. I see. Northern nodded, barely perceptible. So who are you? What is this thing that's supposed to be rightfully yours? The instructor exhaled, then drew a slow breath. It's better to show you. The transformation began. The man grew taller, his skin seeming to melt, flowing like liquid down his body. Northern watched the flesh wash away. His face grew pale as the truth revealed itself. 7 feet tall, at least. The sclera of his eyes blazed black while his pupils burned red. White hair cascaded down his back like a waterfall. His skin, a darkish blue that seemed to drink in the little light of the night, stretched over a frame more intimidating than anything Northern had witnessed before. But those ears, those long, pointed ears sealed it. Even with the altered skin and features, Northern could never mistake what stood before him. An elf, a very strange and unusual one. Dark, ominous armor wove itself around the creature's body like living shadow. He extended his hand, and the sword from the fallen man rolled across the deck, snapping into his grip like a magnet finding metal. Then he swung down with devastating force. The metallic vessel's deck groaned and creaked under the blow. Well then, boy, shall we begin? Northern stayed silent for a moment. Then he exhaled and scratched his head. You are an elf, aren't you? But what kind? I've never seen an elf look so ugly before. But still, do you think it'd change anything? Stevane in his elven form glowered. Such irritating words from a human such as yourself. We dark elves were the first creation, the first children of the first world. But we were cast aside because of our imperfection. Oh well, long stories bore me. What matters is my kind have fought tooth and nail to reach this place today. To reclaim a world that should be ours. I cannot have a reckless boy like you spoil all of that. Chapter 985. Judgment. The man shifted his sword with deliberate precision. Over the past few months, I've carefully gathered intel about you, and I must say you're one lucky bastard. Awakening with a talent that can copy other people's abilities. Hell, it can even gift others whatever it steals. That's one devastating talent, if not the strongest to ever exist. His eyes blazed fierce, dark fire burning within. But there are certain conditions to its usage, aren't there? That's why you can't just waltz around copying talents. Also, giving people your abilities seems to drain you dry, so you don't do it often. Northern's expression turned stone cold. He wondered how exactly he had discovered this, which of the star chasers had spilled his secrets. But he didn't want to ask. The man could have used other means to uncover the truth, though everything he was spouting was built on misconceptions. He sighed. I guess no one can really understand me and how I work. It made sense. Northern was simply an impossible existence to their minds. None of them could picture a body without a soul core possessing talents. It was inconceivable, a living paradox wrapped in flesh. Northern met his gaze with lazy indifference. All right, big man. Entertain me. The dark elf grinned and surged forward like a black tide. He struck Northern with crushing force that should have flattened him. Only Northern stood far beyond such power. The ominous blade sliced through air and stopped inches from Northern's face. A heartbeat later, Northern rose slightly, lifting his head above the man's, then crashed down with a bone-shattering head but that thundered across the clouds. Twilight was creeping through the horizon, and the clouds slowly gained a pale cantaloupe glow. Stevain slammed into the metallic deck, dropping to one knee. He groaned and spat blood, watching as Northern landed with a wince. "Ha! You're strong, no doubt." Northern touched his forehead. "What the hell is your skull made of?" From below, Stevain carved an upward arc, slashing at Northern, but he tilted his head back, letting the blade whistle past his face. Northern clenched his fist. His hand shot forward before Stevain could retract or even see it coming. All he knew was something crushed his stomach and ruptured his organs, sending crimson spraying from his mouth. Northern's hand flashed out, seizing his hair. Instantly, his knee crashed into Stevain's jaw. Another blow hammered his stomach again. All strikes landed before the dark elf could even track them. Northern was fast. Too fast. Stevain groaned in agony, his hair still trapped in Northern's iron grip. He tried to slash at Northern, but the strike froze midway, as if the wind itself had seized him. Northern released his hair and stepped back, then swept his hand forward. The wind roared to life, hurling Stevain away in a howling gale. He crashed into the metal wall of the sliced pagoda and crumpled down. Silent for a moment, Northern waited with his hands clasped behind his back. After a dozen seconds passed, he frowned. "Don't tell me that's all you have to offer." Instantly, a darkish red beam shot out from where he'd fallen. Northern casually extended one hand, and the wind sliced the beam apart, sending fragments flying past his sides to destroy the ship's bow on both ends. Stevain was already upon Northern, flying in a blur, but to Northern he crawled like molasses. With a bored sigh, Northern vanished completely while Stevain was airborne, leaving the dark elf confused for a heartbeat. "Here, doofus." As the dark elf, already carried by his momentum, turned his head, Northern's fist crashed into his face and sent him tearing through the metallic vessel's deck. The entire airship groaned like a wounded beast. Northern hovered in the air, gazing down into the hole the instructor had carved with his body. His face held distant disinterest. Then he slowly descended. Stevain's hand burst from the hole. With raw strength, he tore through the twisted metal and emerged, fury blazing in his eyes. "If this is all you have for me, it'll be disappointing, because I haven't even started trying to fight you. You said you studied me, right? So were you able to devise a way to defeat me? Or is this your best?" Stevain smiled, blood trickling through his teeth. "That we've surely done. But it's not my job." Northern fell silent for a moment. Then he frowned and spoke evenly. Of course there are more of you. But you're contradicting yourself right now. Didn't you say you'd stop me from putting a wrench in your plans?" The instructor grinned. "That'll work out if I stall you long enough." Northern's eyes widened. "The academy? Crap. I was enjoying myself too much." His expression shifted in that instant, and he went silent. Stevain didn't waste the opening. He lunged forward, gripping his sword with both hands and hurling a strike that streaked down from above. Northern frowned and moved forward casually, widening his palm. As he moved it, vicious flames engulfed his hand while ice spread across the floor, trapping the instructor's feet. In one fluid motion, Northern's flaming palm slapped Instructor Stevain's face. Fire consumed his head. "You shouldn't have reminded me, fool." Northern stepped back and watched the man dance about, trying to escape the flames. Then he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The flames exploded with crushing force, the blast thundering across the entire cloud and rippling outward. Casting a cold glance at the dark elf's falling body, Northern soared into the air and landed on his airship. Immediately, the vessel groaned into movement, slowly turning away. As it shoved the metallic ship aside, that one began spiraling downward. However, the falling vessel suddenly stopped mid-plummet. Northern had landed and was already at the helm. The others had rounded up the students and were tending to them. Northern frowned as his airship pulled away. A chill of dread crept up his spine. The metallic vessel slowly rose back up, pulsing in an eerie rhythm. The metallic beast was groaning again. And this time, it wasn't a metaphor. Chapter 986. The Beginning of the End. Northern watched with a subtle frown creasing his delicate olive features as the airship began its unholy change. No, change wasn't the right word. This felt more like a revealing, or perhaps a breaking free. Something was clawing its way out from within the metallic shell, desperate to escape the prison of steel and bolts. The sight made Northern's lips curl downward. He could almost taste something bitter on his tongue. A wide split tore across the bow, and pale crimson light bled from within. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, though far more unsettling than rhythmic. The entire metallic body rippled. Steel turned to liquid, waves rolling across the surface. Black tendrils stretched from the ship's core, each ending in white, pristine teeth built for crushing rather than tearing. The tendrils writhed in the air, still forming, still reaching. Northern gave them one last glance before turning away. As he did, the tower ship's bow shifted, veering from the grotesque vessel. A more complete tentacle lashed forward. But the wind itself recoiled, blasting the appendage back before it could strike. Northern turned, his face calm and unreadable. Right? You'll cause trouble if I let you be. He studied the monstrosity with cold eyes. Well then. Northern raised his hand. Above the changing ship, the air shimmered and trembled. Even the instructors on deck watched with tense faces as pressure built in the sky. The air tore open with crackling sparks. Something black and glossy plummeted through the rift, too fast to track. The moment it struck the airship, a sonic shockwave rippled outward. The rift sparked again. Something else was coming. The first had been Corpse Eater. Though not the most active of Northern's void summons, he commanded the legion of souls within the limitless void. He wasn't growing stronger, but he was definitely growing smarter. The second entity Northern summoned was different. Mr. Fluffy. Northern never expected such overwhelming presence to crush the very air around them. Twilight had broken through the clouds, casting radiant light through the mist. But whatever emerged from that rift plunged everything back into darkness. Though nothing had changed to the naked eye. Something fell from the tear in space. First it looked like snow drifting down. Then the limbs emerged fully, and its form became clear. For enormous paws descended, along with a body of white fur that flowed like waves of fresh snow. Mr. Fluffy's blue eyes blazed with ancient, fathomless light. He had taken his gigantic form. As he landed on the creature ship, the vessel couldn't bear his weight. It buckled. One side tilted, then began its slow dive toward the earth below. Every tentacle responded, formed, malformed, and unformed alike. But Mr. Fluffy was more than enough to handle them all. Landing on the ship, his size filled the entire bow of the airship, causing it to tilt and drop under his sheer weight. His claws and fangs showed no mercy. With brutal efficiency, he tore through the liquid metallic body of the ship creature, rending it apart in a furious blaze. What had been pale crimson light now sprayed out in showers, staining the beautiful cantaloupe clouds of twilight. Northern couldn't see what happened next. The tower ship had traveled quite far by then. The last thing he heard in the distance was an unholy, wrong cry that made his skin crawl. Afterward, he continued his journey to the academy. It didn't take long. Barely a dozen minutes later, the academy's wall came into perfect view. And it explained why the instructors' faces had turned pale, struck with plain disbelief. Even Celis, Helena, and Vector had their eyes frozen wide, mouths hanging open. Vector gasped, shaking his head in amazement. Good stars. I never thought I'd live to see this mighty wall torn down. I never even thought it was possible. Celis grimaced darkly. Whatever did this? Honestly, I can't even imagine how massive it must have been. The instructors stared ahead with terrible expressions. Fear, anxiety, and disbelief mixing into a strange, unspeakable cocktail of reactions. Northern remained strangely quiet. Of course, he'd been surprised too when he first saw it, though that had been over 24 seconds ago. The students seemed most shaken by the wall's sorry state. The academy's metal wall looked as if a gigantic clawed hand had shredded it from the cloud's embrace down to the very ground that held its foundations. Not all the students were awake. After being tended to, Shay had awakened, along with the pink-haired girl, Len, Tever and Aster. All of them stared with deep, grim expressions. As the ship slowed, gliding over the wide mountain chasm, which had once contained the crimson clouds but now sat empty, Northern frowned. "I see," explains the strange color of the clouds. Even though day was breaking, the clouds remained red, as if bleeding. This part of the island seemed untouched by the rising sun. Then Northern spotted Dante and several others in black military uniforms. He raised his brow, almost confused. Then he frowned and scoffed, muttering, "This bastard. Well, that's not surprising." Dante, as the shadow of a strangely built ship covered part of the mountain, raised his head with a scowl creasing his face. Observing the change in their lieutenant's mood, Azit looked up. "How are they here? I thought those strange people stole all the ships." The other guy, with black spiky hair though not as rebellious as Azit's, grinned wickedly. "Should Azit and I go take care of him?" Now that one looked at them both, there was a subtle, almost dismissible resemblance between the two. Their eyes were both dark and full of dangerous energy. However, Azit was much shorter than Asden. Call looked at the pair and glanced up again. "Those fools. I thought they said they could stop him from reaching the academy." Behind his plain face, he hid deep, primal hatred and disgust for everything around him. The military men surrounding him. The dark elf circumstances had forced him to ally with decades back. He hated everything he'd been forced to settle for, things that weren't part of his plan due to one situation or another. And most of all, he truly hated how persistent and undefeatable Northern was. He'd lost more than half his lifespan because he'd encountered this strange kid on different occasions. And now, Northern was being a burrowing worm in his sandbox of plans. Call finally sighed and looked at them both. "Neither of you Forsaken twins should come back if that boy isn't defeated." Asden grinned fiercely. "Expect nothing less." Both suddenly lowered themselves in perfect synchronization. Then, with the same fluid motion, they catapulted toward the ship. Chapter 987. The calm. Northern stared down with an indifferent, blank expression, watching two figures leap from below and latch themselves onto the tower's underside. Northern closed his eyes briefly. "Let's see. What defense mechanisms does this tower possess?" Since the tower's control room sat nestled within his consciousness, Northern held direct access to its contents through his mind. All he needed was to sift through his memories like searching through files. Within seconds, a smile crept across his face. "Found it." The moment Azit and Aston launched themselves upward, they clung to the ship's base like geckos, their hands seeming to stick to the surface. They began scaling the concrete hull at an utterly inhuman pace. Just as they neared the ship's bow edge, one of the layered hull bricks groaned and split open. Aston froze, glancing down with narrowed eyes. "Ignore it," he commanded. As he turned his gaze upward again, a fierce gust erupted from the opening, battering both climbers. Being paragons, mere wind couldn't dislodge them, though it slowed their progress. The ship's rim lay only 5 more handholds away. More hull bricks creaked open. The wind grew savage, their black coats snapping violently in the tempest. Then the very bricks beneath their grip split apart, plunging them into the yawning darkness before they could react. The tower swallowed them whole. Call observed from below. He clicked his tongue in disgust. Useless things. His scowl deepened as he studied the airship with sharper focus. Recognition sparked in Call's eyes like a struck match. "Ah, isn't that the Tower of Trammel?" His expression darkened further. He'd overlooked it initially. Such a sight wasn't common in his long existence. The tower had wandered endlessly until the Origins seized it, transforming it into a prison for the Chaos Prince. Later, the Chaos Prince claimed it as his domain. That brat. Still, how Northern, bearer of the Chaos Prince's vestige, had stumbled upon such a relic puzzled him. Fate? Impossible. Call shook his head slightly. Fate lacked the cunning for such elaborate schemes. This had to be the Chaos Prince's doing. The Chaos Prince is dead. Don't overthink this. Naturally, his immense power left remnants that still shaped the world. The Leviathan lurking beneath the crimson cloud was born from his body's decay. His soul's vestige, the one Call had carefully orchestrated Northern to absorb, would draw all chaotic forces, ready to be fed to cryos upon his awakening. His frown shifted, realization dawning. What if it was drawn to the vestige? That explanation made perfect sense for why Northern possessed the Tower of Trammel. Since the tower had grown intimately familiar with the Chaos Prince, after its master's death, it could have wandered through the underworld into the upper world, seeking the vestige, explaining how Northern stumbled upon it. That meant the tower likely knew how to traverse between worlds. Call raised an eyebrow. Fascinating. Yet he seemed uninterested. It wasn't as if he couldn't return to the underworld whenever he wished. Still, the Tower of Trammel was a remarkable structure. Owning it would prove invaluable. A paragon behind him finally spoke, shattering his thoughts. Boss, should I go instead? This one sported purple hair cropped short, with sharp, slanted eyes, small and eerily calm. Too calm. Call didn't turn around. Pointless. You'll meet the same fate. The young soldier bowed respectfully. What do we do then? We wait. The three behind him exchanged bewildered glances. The one with black, wavy hair spoke up. Lieutenant, we didn't come here to wait. Another chimed in. We can't just stand idle while the academy burns. We must play our part in carving history. Call turned back, his expression sour. So, you want to charge down there and slaughter instructors too? All for our cause. The calm one lowered his head slightly. I dare say, that's exactly what we've been doing all along. What's different now? Because they're instructors or students. Boss, don't tell me your friend's death is making you soft. Call's jaw clenched. If he didn't need these fools, he'd have killed them all on the spot. Of course, it wasn't that they couldn't kill. Call simply didn't want to waste precious time cutting down fodder. He'd framed it hoping they'd show some restraint. Apparently, they were too far gone for morality. He sighed, watching flames devour the academy below. You know what? Go do your thing. Storm the academy and destroy whatever you please. I have somewhere else to be. The three bowed and vanished. Call exhaled shakily, releasing his sweaty palms before looking up at Northern. The tower ship hovered over the chasm, nearly across completely. Yet Northern's gaze remained fixed on Call, or rather, Lieutenant Dante as everyone knew him. Northern watched as Call turned away, beginning his descent down the mountain. A flicker of concern crossed Northern's mind. Where is he going? He harbored a vague suspicion but remained curious about Call's true destination. Even more intriguing was how Call knew of that place's existence. If indeed that's where he was headed. Northern sighed, facing forward. First, I must help Annette. He walked slowly to the ship's bow, leaping onto its rim. Hands at his sides, he stared at the gaping wound in the academy's walls. He still remembered his first arrival. Not even 2 years ago, when everything had seemed so perfect. Those walls had been heavily fortified, reinforced metal. He'd thought nothing could breach them. Who would have imagined that the very thing capable of tearing them down lay caged beneath? Northern's gaze drifted to the chasm's dark, hollow depths. What could have been down there? He paused, touching his chest. And why does my entire body feel so heavy? Something writhed inside him, like a caged beast clawing to break free through his ribs. The sensation had only begun minutes ago as they'd reached the mountain chasm. Northern fought to keep himself steady. He couldn't understand why chaos was suddenly stirring, but he was certain it connected to whatever creature had escaped from the chasm's depths. This made Northern question how the coming battle would unfold, especially when he did not plan to unleash any ability tied to chaos and void. Chapter 988. Sage Annette. She circled back and plunged toward the sky, stopping for a moment. A ball of fire ignited as she opened her hands. It exploded outward with searing heat, making the air blow with hot wind. Everyone braced themselves and stepped back. In half a second, after the flames ignited, all of them were already sweating. The tentacles tore out of the ground, scattering debris and sending large chunks spraying into the air like they were weightless. Some crashed into pillars. Some crashed into instructors who were too slow to react. The whole ground of the academy was a mess. Holes decorated the earth in different patterns, as if gigantic moles had burrowed up from below. But it was all the result of Annette trying to defeat the creature. She didn't think it could be defeated. She had been fighting the creature for almost 20 minutes, and she could swear that every second of those 20 minutes had been her using her entire life and strength to protect herself from instant death. If the creature hit her once, there was no escaping it. She was going to die. That was why she flew through the air with a speed she never thought she could reach. She had claimed that she would hold the monster down, but in battle, she was barely holding onto her own life. The tentacles drew back, writhing for a moment, as if they were waiting and watching. Then suddenly they launched forward. One went first, turning to a blur. Then two followed with crushing speed. The flames in Annette suddenly compressed into a small dot of fire. The compression exploded a vast shockwave of hot wind that caused the loose concrete stones to lose their hold and crumble immediately. She held it with one finger, her eyes blazing but calm. Then a shadow fell upon her face. As the tentacles flew toward her with deadly speed, she pointed the flames at them and spoke. Flames of ruin. The air went silent and dead for a moment. Then the world was swallowed by flames. An enormous, all-consuming cone of fire exploded outward, so vast and hungry that it seemed to swallow even the sky as it ate through the ground, flying forward with great speed and devouring everything in its path. Everything was blazed by the massive cone of flames and swallowed. The flames blasted toward the creature itself, standing like a dragon rooted from the depths of hell. Its eyes did not blaze or shine with any light. They seemed dull and lightless, but primal and filled with a depth of something that made anyone who looked directly into those crimson voids feel uncomfortable and afraid. The evil dragon opened its massive jaws, revealing endless rows of sharp, narrow fangs. Each fang could serve as a sword on its own, sitting together like conspirators in an evil conference deciding the world's fate. The creature opened its maws wide. Instead of flames consuming everything, it began to swallow them. The flames shot forward with greater force, destroying the ground and turning the sky's clouds to vapor, only to be devoured by the evil dragon's gaping jaws. After devouring the flames, it belched. Smoke poured from its mouth and nose. Annette stood frozen, dismay written across her face. She stared at the creature, her eyes wide and trembling. The tentacles shook for a moment, then shot forward with lightning speed. They didn't fly straight. They twisted and rolled like sea serpents swimming through water, moving with deadly grace. Something else was different about them now. Annette didn't wait to find out what. They were coming for her fast. The fire beneath her feet blazed fiercer. She launched into the sky to escape the tentacles, but they followed, shooting upward in wavy patterns that didn't slow their incredible speed. Annette rolled as she reached the clouds. She stretched both hands out. Fire exploded from her palms, then condensed and shaped into two long swords. The compression was so intense they glowed like flames from a volcano's core. Deep, molten red. Gloves of fire covered Annette's hands as she gripped them. Flames danced around her body, tracing the delicate metal armor she had summoned when the fight began. A cloak of fire erupted behind her back. A helmet of flames covered her head, leaving only her eyes, nose, and mouth visible like a sentinel's mask. Fire blazed and flowed from the helm like burning cloth. Even her boots were carved from flames. High in the sky, Annette watched the tentacles reach for her. Each one was enormous. Too enormous. Tentacles weren't supposed to be that large and thick. She glared at them and clicked her tongue. This would be the perfect time for Northern to show up. I sure as hell can't defeat a Leviathan alone. I can't even scratch this damn thing. She surged forward in an explosion of flames, holding both flame swords ready. A split second before collision, she tilted her entire body sideways, dodging the tentacle's cruel maw and gliding down its long, thick length. Annette moved like a tide of fire and steel. She whirled around the mass of the first tentacle, slicing with her flame swords as she glided around 1-0 at breakneck speed. Her entire body writhed in flames that exploded with surging speed and force, propelling her beyond her usual limits. The whirling descent was swift, incredibly swift. She hit the ground with bone-jarring force, concrete scattering like broken glass. But she didn't rest. She was already moving, running at blistering speed. She knew the truth. As spectacular as that attack looked, it hadn't left a single scratch on the tentacle. Worse, 3 more had turned and were diving down. As she rolled forward, they crushed the ground in rapid succession. She ran like her life depended on it, because it did. The tentacles were terrifyingly fast, especially flying through the wind right beside her. One lunged sideways to crush her, but Annette slammed her legs to a sudden stop. Using perfect momentum control, she leaped backward. The tentacle crushed empty air. The second tentacle moved too, and they crashed into each other in that vacant space. The third was behind her. Another was diving down from above. She couldn't fly up, turn back, or continue forward. The time it would take to turn and run, the third would catch her, even with her flames boosting her speed. Worse, that sudden stop and momentum shift had strained Annette's leg terribly. As she tried to move, she felt something snap, causing a slight delay in her movement. That delay was enough to seal her death when fighting a Leviathan. Annette's eyes widened with fear and pain as the tentacles flew toward her with their relentless, blistering speed. "I'm going to die." As the third tentacle was about to crush her head and the one above came within a meter of turning her to paste, everything froze, turned to ice. Chapter 989. The Storm. Annette stood, her chest heaving. Each ragged breath escaped invisible puffs, white vapor cutting through the frigid air. Dawn should have brought bitter cold, but this battlefield had blazed so fiercely that everyone had forgotten winter's bite was supposed to claim them. Her fires, after all, belonged to one of the ancient heritages of drifters, power whose roots ran as deep as Riemgard itself. Her family, her clan, stood among the oldest and most formidable, even though most wielded hammers instead of swords. Annette's eyes swept the scene, wide with disbelief. Relief flooded through her first. She had survived. The thought should have comforted her. But who could have done this? Her gaze trembled as it took in the sudden, absolute freeze that had claimed everything and made the air terribly cold. Then her eyes found the Leviathan. Her legs gave out. She hit the ground hard. The evil dragon, frozen solid, its massive form trapped in ice, every scale and claw locked in crystal stillness. A voice drifted to her ears, from above or behind. She couldn't tell. "It won't last long. Don't act like everything has ended." That voice. She knew it. Heart leaping, she spun her head. There, emerging from the very air itself, his form taking shape as if the wind had woven him back together, stood the voice's owner. The name burst from her lips. Northern. Northern gazed down, his expression cool and faintly mocking. "Why do you look so pitiful, Master Annette?" She scowled. "You little pest. And what took you so long?" Northern studied her briefly, then lifted his gaze to the frozen Leviathan. "I was saving the world." Annette's face turned to stone. "Say what now?" Northern looked back at her. What's with that look you're making?" Annette laughed, struggling to her feet. "Nothing. It just sounds wrong coming from you. I thought you were more likely to end the world than save it. I guess you've had some character growth." Northern turned away. "Shut up." He stretched his hand down to her. Annette looked at his offered hand, then at his face, still turned away. A small smile touched her lips as she grasped it. "All right, no jokes. You really have grown." Northern pulled her up and let out a breath, studying the creature trapped within its icy tomb. A literal mountain of ice. His brow creased with worry. This is all Absolute Zero could manage. And the effect last time was so devastating. I thought it would finish everything. When Northern had used Absolute Zero before, it had wiped out hordes of behemoths without a trace. It should have frozen everything into nothingness. But the Leviathan proved too mighty a force to simply erase, which explained why a mountain of ice now dominated the academy grounds. Though it rose from the inner compound, the frozen peak stretched so high it cast shadows over walls 200 meters away. Deep within the ice, a red glow began to pulse. Faint at first, but growing brighter. Northern stared at it, his frown deepening like storm clouds gathering. Annette caught the look on his face and turned to the ice mountain. Her expression darkened to match his. What are our chances against a Leviathan? Northern lingered, watching the red glow brighten and dim, as if the beast struggled against its frozen prison. He sighed. The best I managed was cutting one's hand off and shoving it back where it came from, and that drained my entire essence. I slept for over 10 hours. Annette nodded slowly. I see. So that means you'll be sleeping for 24 hours this time. Northern shot her a look. I know you're not the sharpest, Master Annette, but at least try to make your brain work sometimes. Want to die? What I'm saying is this will be brutal. Very brutal. I'll need more hands. Annette glanced around. Besides Vita, I don't see anyone else here worth a damn. They're all useless bodies stuffed with hot air. Sounds personal, but whatever. I'm not talking about those. My summons will arrive soon. Annette's eyes widened. Oh, right. Wait, summons? You have more of those? Northern couldn't answer. A thunderous crack split the sky. The ice mountain had begun to break. He sighed once more. There hasn't been a moment's rest for 2 days straight. Well, except when I passed out. But that doesn't count. Annette raised an eyebrow. What are you muttering about when a Leviathan is stirring right in front of us? Northern's expression hardened. Dark light swirled around his body as black armor formed. Lustrous plates with a small dent over the chest. The helmet sealed around his head, for blazing blue lights piercing through the visor like predator's eyes. He looked at Annette through those fearsome lights. Support me however you can. Then he launched forward, shooting toward the sky. He stopped mid-air, hovering at eye level with the monster now shattering its icy cage. The breaking sounds flooded the air, mixed with something deeper. A low, rumbling groan. Northern held his position and watched. Below, everyone else scattered as ice shards and white smoke rained down. Something else seemed to be happening deeper in the academy, but Northern stayed focused on this threat. Whatever else was brewing, they'd have to handle it themselves. Even if he could be in 2 places at once, he'd rather face this alone. He'd need every ounce of power to fight a Leviathan, which was completely insane and stupid, but he'd run out of choices long ago. He'd come too far down this path of insane and stupid to turn back now. Northern folded his arms, waiting as the creature rose from a flood of white fog. Despite the thick mist, the evil dragon's eyes burned through like twin suns. The monstrous beast stopped, and slowly the light in its eyes dimmed, but didn't die completely. Only a flicker remained, barely alive yet somehow more menacing. The look was lifeless and eerie at once, like death itself had taken notice. The monster stared down at the boy floating before it. Northern spread his arms wide. Ice and fire javelins burst into existence, filling the entire sky in a single heartbeat. Their shadows blanketed the ground below like a dark promise. Oh well, shall we begin? Chapter 990. New Sun. Everywhere was silent for a moment as if holding its breath for the coming battle. Then a storm of sound broke loose. All 4 massive tentacles broke out of the ice frames, causing a loud shatter to ring through the entire sky. They surged forth with screaming speed, flying towards Northern in a blur of motion. Northern, of course, did not mind them. Surrounded by void force, all they met was the push of endless space that blocked them from striking their target. But they were quite stubborn, battering the air with wild force that made shockwaves ripple out and blasted the very air with explosive power. Northern did not move despite the fact that the very air seemed to be almost breaking behind him. Even though the enormous tentacles were striking with horrible fury, they seemed extra mad and desperate to get through to him, but he was calm. He just stayed floating mid-air, his hands at the ready, with thousands of ice and fire lances lined up above him, waiting for his command while he locked eyes with the monster's fearsome and dull gaze. At last Northern smiled and raised one hand. All the lances came to life, the fire crackled and the ice hissed. He looked at the monster again, then dropped his hand. The attack began. Everything fell down hard, and began to pound the monster that stood like a living mountain. The Leviathan did not flinch even as thousands of ice and fire spears rained down on it. All it did was continue to stare. In fact, for a moment, one could think it was an actual mountain. After the attack was done, smoke covered the sky, and everything for a moment was blurred. The tentacles were still battering the air, stubbornly trying to break through where Northern was, and the very air was still as firm, never planning to give way. Northern breathed out and began to lift his hand. The air began to get hot and hotter by the second. Annette was on the ground, waiting for the perfect moment that she'd need to dive in and assist her student, but no matter how much she was looking, she was not seeing that time coming now. The tentacles were moving at an even wilder rate than they had been all the while. Watching it was actually making her realize how well she had done outrunning those deadly things. But at the same time it made her go pale yet again. Because the boy she had watched grow from nothing was floating mid-air, totally unbothered by them. She felt sweat pour down her face. Her inner clothes were getting soaked and sticking to her body. At first she thought herself to be so awed and terrified at Northern's strength that she was sweating all over before the heat got so unbearable and she realized. A frown creased on her face. It's not supposed to be this hot. It was winter after all. It was very strange. The sudden rise in heat was very strange. And it only took that moment for her to realize. With a battle going on in the air, it was quite easy to guess. Northern or the Leviathan was about to unleash something. Whichever one of them it was going to be would decide the lives of all the living souls in the academy today. Then the strangest of things happened. A new son was born. Annette's eyes widened at what she saw. A burning circle ignited behind Northern. Blazing. No, it wasn't blazing. It was simply glowing. But what it was giving off couldn't be called heat. Heat seemed to be the very core of its being. It gave off a state of deep molten fire that burned the very air. Everything was threatened by the very presence of this air. Because the line between boiling and melting at that point felt so blurred that existence itself seemed like it would just vanish from the pure heat. Of course, drifters like Annette and Vita could still handle it, even though it was no less painful, but other instructors had it far worse. Their bodies were rising with smoke and they were running deeper into the academy for safe shelter. Everywhere was in chaos. And in the middle of all of that, a tiny sun sat behind Northern's back, giving him the look of some old god that belonged not to this world. Northern raised one hand in front of him, his 4 blazing eyes showing cold threat. The tentacles of the Leviathan never stopped thrashing through all of this, wildly battering the air and trying to break it. However, Northern had never cared now, he never cared before. Instead, he did something wild. Something he could always do but had never thought to try. Now that he was more focused and was always thinking of ways to use his talents more thanks to depending on chaos and void less, he thought of something that could be possible with DIY. DIY allowed him to mix his talent abilities into each other. There was no line. He could take an ability from Frostheart and use it with an ability from Whispering Gale. But he had never tried to use one ability on the other. Not use them with the other. Northern breathed out, cold breath seeping out of the tiny holes of not just his helmet but his entire armor. His very body seemed to be giving off freezing air. The light in his eyes blazed a bit brighter and suddenly seemed to freeze in its brightness. Following that, the strangest thing happened. First, there was a terrible and strangely weird drop in the temperature. Annette noticed it quickly. Not just her. It was too sharp and the difference in temperature was too clear considering that barely a second ago, their bodies were about to melt. Now, it seemed like they were going to freeze to death. Looking up, Annette's eyes widened. The tiny sun behind Northern had frozen. Chapter 991. Battlefield of Gods. It hung behind him like a massive, perfect sphere of ice, cold mist streaming from its surface in ghostly wisps. Northern studied his own body, noting what freezing the sun had done to him. His form had changed completely from what it once was. Being able to connect with the world around him at a deeper level meant he could tap into several of his talents and their powers, especially the elemental ones. This meant some reactions from Northern's elemental talent could directly touch his body. Or to put it more clearly, his body could drink from the benefits that flowed from it. Extreme cold made the body brittle and stiff, slowing it down like rusted metal. That's why Northern hadn't relied on just the ice side of his talent. That's exactly why he had frozen the sun. While he wrapped Frostheart around Sun Legacy, the latter still burned bright and kept strengthening his body. But Northern was using that stiff point in his muscles, so he needed the ice. He used the sun's heat to keep his muscles rigid while stretching their snapback power. It was dangerous and should have been impossible, but Northern's body defied the rules. He did this because he needed the raw power. Northern could have switched his name to Titan's Reckoning or Burning Flame to boost his strength. But he also needed his talents to work together like a well-oiled machine. Sure, he could make a clone and use them as different tools just like before. But Northern held back because of the difficulty of being two people at the same time. If it was anything weaker, especially groups of monsters, he wouldn't have cared. But right now, he had to watch every move like a chess master. This was a Leviathan. He couldn't test things out against this kind of beast. There was one more gift from how his body worked with his elemental talents. Northern drew breath, cold air pouring from every gap in his armor like winter's ghost. Then he spun fast, throwing a punch that cut through the air like lightning. The blow smashed into the tentacle that whipped toward him. The entire world shook from a powerful blast that ripped outward with bone-rattling force. Then the tentacle broke apart. Everything shattered into a spray of ice chunks that rained down and struck the stone. Annette dodged one huge piece of ice and looked down. There, it really looked like solid ice all the way through. This was different from something being frozen. It seemed like over 100 meters of the tentacle had turned into pure ice and exploded into pieces. All from his punch? Her eyes trembled. Northern, what has he become? She hadn't even scratched that thing with everything she had. And she was a sage. It made no sense unless he was a paragon. Even in theory, it was impossible for a paragon to beat a Leviathan. But of course, there were monsters who had fought nothing but evil creatures above their level and had grown incredibly strong even as sages or paragons. In fact, the only reason why she survived was because she was part of such a category. Any other sage would have died before they even began. After all, the head instructor that quivered in fear was also a sage. Northern too was part of such category. The only problem was that it should have been impossible for Northern to reach paragon level. It wasn't that simple. I'm sure he's not a paragon. He'd be stronger than this if he was. Even though Annette wrestled with wonder, she got it. Northern really was a sage like her, but his power had shot past his rank and maybe sat right next to a paragon's strength. Maybe, when he finally became a paragon, Northern would be as strong as a transcendent. Her eyes went wide. Her heart felt like it might burst from the thrill. Transcendent. She tried to wrap her mind around it but couldn't grasp anything. A transcendent was, after all, something that hadn't been seen in 2 whole eras. Meanwhile, Northern was already cutting through the air, sliding at a terrifying speed that made him invisible to most other drifters. Only the cold trails that hung in his wake could be used to track where he had been, and even then, he was already long gone before anyone's eyes reached that spot. The tentacles chased him with stunning skill, almost catching up at times. This made it hard to follow the tentacles themselves, but they were so long and thick that they could still be traced no matter what. Following them let everyone watching from below find the flying man in the end, but they kept missing him. Before they could lock their eyes on him, he was already somewhere else. He moved so fast that their eyes hurt trying to track him. Some of them were crying. Not from sadness, staring too hard had made their eyes water. And the tears froze solid before they could touch their cheeks. The battlefield felt wrong in every way. It felt like a war zone for beings born in the age of stars, the time of legends. Beings that could crack worlds with a snap of thunder. Beings that should not exist in this time at all. All of them, mostly the teachers. Both the ones who had followed Northern and the ones still at the school stood frozen, staring up with faces full of awe. They squinted hard, horror slowly eating away at their expressions. Even the other majors that had been tearing through the school had stopped at some point, watching the scene play out with deep frowns. Some shook their heads. How in the world? The air itself seemed to hold its breath at the awful speed Northern was moving with. Then it shook with fear of being torn apart by the mad speed the tentacles chased Northern with. The fact that they could even match such speed was shocking and really showed the endless power of a leviathan. The creature's main body had not made any real moves except when it dug through the academy wall and brought it down with its huge tentacles, and when it broke free from the ice mountain Northern had trapped it with. Northern flew at a speed that broke every rule of how fast a human could move. No one watching him could have believed, even in their wildest dreams, that he was just a sage. He was too powerful, so much that the sage title felt like it was dragging him down instead of lifting him up. Chapter 992. Seated Among the Stars. With the strength Northern had shown at the start, many couldn't grasp why he was fleeing from the tentacles. They expected him to spin around at any moment and bang, drive an ice-breaking punch into another tentacle. Instead, all he did was run. Even his escape defied mortal limits. Northern wasn't running without purpose, though. His goal was to draw the monster itself into battle, and that wouldn't happen while the tentacles remained. So he should just destroy them, right? He'd considered that. But Northern could see something others missed. The monster might look like it was moving, but it was pouring energy into controlling the tentacles. That pool of power was vast. So vast that if the creature itself started moving, it would spell doom for everyone. That's why Northern's plan wasn't to destroy the tentacles outright. Instead, he'd force the monster to use them as much as possible, for as long as he could endure it. Then he'd destroy them. The deadly dance continued through the air, growing more dangerous by the second. Northern flew like the wind itself, blurring past buildings while tentacles crashed through them with crushing force. Stone chunks scattered and sprayed across the ground, making everything shake. Northern would make sharp, impossible turns in the air like some top-tier Iran military missile. Those had been deadly in his time on Earth. Who knew how deadly they were now, if Earth still existed? His turns were so sharp they seemed to slice through the air itself. The tentacles struggled to follow such movements. Their edges blurred until they almost faded from sight. They smashed into buildings and veered off course. It was both terrifying and amazing to watch. At some point, the tentacles shed their bulk for speed. They thinned out and burst with hot air, becoming whip-like tendrils, thinner but carrying more deadly force. Then they shot forward with new speed. Now they stopped chasing Northern from behind and moved right next to him, lashing out with desperate fury. Northern would glide away to dodge the whip strikes, making the air tremble each time. Sometimes the force of impact between tentacles and air was so strong that concrete scattered on the ground below. Northern didn't stop. He would glance at the monster now and then but kept moving at that incredible speed, a frozen sun hanging behind him like a banner. Ice spears formed around Northern and shot forward with air blasts, exploding with force that slowed one tentacle for a moment. One recoiled, another veered off course, but the third weaved through and charged forward without pause. Northern spun and flew toward that one with blazing speed. Just as they were about to collide, he swept up slightly and glided over its body, racing along its serpentine length while his fingertips brushed its rough surface. A soft smile played on his lips. The sky turned dark and gloomy, as if a storm was about to break loose. Annette and the other instructors looked up with pale faces. What now? This was winter. Rain couldn't possibly fall at a time like this. And with the way the weather had been shifting on the battlefield in the last few minutes, it was easy to guess who was behind it again. A bolt of lightning suddenly fell from the sky, landing in Northern's hand. He flew back, wrapped in a backdrop of violently sparking electricity. One particular bolt danced in his grip as he threw his arm back and hurled the lightning forward. The entire sky seemed to follow that strike. The spectators' eyes went wide. Annette froze in terrible shock. Hoo-ow wow! Her mouth felt like it might tear from stretching so wide. Instructors scattered around the area all looked up, their faces twisted with fear. What humans couldn't understand, they feared with every fiber of their being. Vida stood near a corner where a chunk of stone had fallen minutes ago during Northern's chase with the tentacles. She stared at him, eyes narrowed. She tried to remember their first meeting. Back then, he'd seemed like some rude, cocky brat who'd stumbled onto power by pure luck. But now he looked like a man. Something had changed in how he used each ability. He knew what he was doing. The look in his eyes was deep and commanding, though he never looked at anything or anyone for too long. Her lips parted slightly. The words caught for a moment before she managed to whisper to herself. He has become a man. She had no idea why that made her heart race, or why she was starting to wonder if she could be the type of woman he'd want. She shook her head hard. My God! We're in the middle of a battle. A massive thud echoed across the entire battlefield. The sound of 100 rolling thunders. The ground trembled and split. Earthquakes ran deep into the Earth's core and spread like wildfire. Everyone scrambled for safety from the enormous attack. When they all settled and the shaking stopped, they lifted their heads to find only 2 tentacles remained. Northern hovered somewhere in the air, watching the last traces of lightning fade from his hand. Did I put too much void essence into that? The power of his abilities, whether copied or owned, depended on how much void essence he poured into them. And if there was one thing Northern had plenty of, it was void essence. The void essence Northern put into a single attack could drain the entire pool of a mature sage. That's what gave such crushing power to what should have been a simple strike. Nasira, Shay, and the student council were just getting to their feet after being knocked down by the earthquake. They stared up at Northern with blank, stunned faces. Shay trembled slightly. He's beyond our league. They'd always known, at least since the tournament began. They knew Northern was strong. But there was a difference between knowing someone sat among the stars and thinking they simply sat above you. Stars were unreachable. Northern showed a level of power that everyone there, instructors and student council alike, didn't just fear. They feared the very idea of reaching that height. He stood above them all, at a level both staggering and terrifying. Chapter 993, Descent of a Phoenix. The remaining 2 tentacles coiled together before Northern, as if studying him with silent calculation. Northern scratched his hair, heat creeping up his neck. How do I explain this? He gestured awkwardly. I never meant for your buddy to die, just wanted to slow him down a bit. But I doubt any of you care. After all, you're just appendages. Yet he found himself questioning that assumption. The tentacles moved with purpose, behaved as if they possessed minds of their own. Still, the frozen, bone-chilling glare of the Leviathan loomed behind him, a stark reminder that his true enemy towered like a living mountain. Should I just unleash chaos and void? One snap of my fingers, and this could all end. But at what price? Now that Northern understood the devastating toll of chaos and void, he shuddered at what such raw power might demand in return. Northern shook his head and steeled himself. He would defeat this thing one way or another. It would be brutal, maybe impossible, and hell, he had no clue how he'd pull it off. But he would triumph over the Leviathan. Death wasn't even on the table. That resolve occupied one corner of his mind. The other corner churned with questions about Call. Had he ventured into the underground dungeon? How did he know about it? And what might unfold in the next few moments? Either way, Northern had decided to stop toying with the tentacles. The damage he was about to unleash wouldn't be ordinary. It would be the kind that carved new landscapes. Drawing from the entire essence reserve his clone possessed, Northern extended one hand. Not toward the tentacles, toward the Leviathan itself standing like a stone titan. Twilight Phoenix. The sky transformed for the 3rd time today, now burning the color of ripe cantaloupe. Flames seemed to rage through the heavens themselves. Northern had deliberately aimed at the Leviathan because of the ability's sheer destructive force. He'd witnessed this power reshape an entire mountain range. Without question, it would reduce the Academy to ash and rubble. Let's not underestimate the Academy. They might have barriers or something. Northern offered this weak excuse to his conscience. The clouds grew scorching, their color intensifying as if a silent explosion was already rolling through them from beyond. Then something terrible descended from above. Its screech ripped through the atmosphere, through reality itself. The piercing cry seemed to tear into eardrums, shredding the very organs of hearing. But that wasn't even the real devastation. Everyone stood frozen, so shaken by the screech that they couldn't brace for the true destruction bearing down on them. There was no screech last time. Was it because I used more void essence this time? From the cantaloupe-colored sky, the twilight phoenix began to descend. It wasn't a bird. It was calamity given wings. A storm of fire shaped like a divine beast, its wings a tapestry of sunflower and ruin. Each beat of its wings sent pulses of blistering heat rippling through the atmosphere, turning the air itself into molten glass. Its tail was a flaming comet that split clouds apart. And its eyes, those cruel, radiant coals, burned with knowing sentience, as if it resented being summoned again. The world held its breath. As it plummeted, the sky folded in on itself, collapsing into streaks of color and heat distortion. Trees ignited instantly across the horizon. The lake behind the Academy hissed and boiled into mist. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight, vaporized before they could cry out. And still the Leviathan stood unmoving, like a god sculpted from the bones of the deep, like a monument to the abyss itself. It did not flinch. It did not even blink. The twilight phoenix screamed again. Only this time, the sound didn't echo. It shattered. The sound wave broke across dimensions, ricocheting inside skulls, scrambling thought into static. Lesser monsters hiding across the forest of the island clawed at their heads, bleeding from the eyes. Then it hit. A collision that wasn't just heard or seen, but felt in the soul. The phoenix collided with the Leviathan's chest in a blinding detonation. Not just fire, sound, and force. All of it. For an instant the world became light. Then came the eruption. A wall of flame radiated outward like a nova, disintegrating everything in its radius. The stone beneath the Leviathan turned liquid, then vaporized. Entire swaths of the surrounding terrain buckled and collapsed into scorched craters. The shockwave reached the Academy walls seconds later. The tall, alloyed metal walls, engineered by architects of defense and sealed by barrier runes, stood no chance. The first impact rippled through them. The second folded them like paper. Entire battlements twisted, screaming under thermal stress, before exploding outward in molten shards. Towers fell in pieces, crumbling like brittle bones. Windows across the structure detonated from sheer pressure. Bunkers below ground shook, their protective enchantments unraveling in sparks and failing glyphs. Alarms wailed, but even those began to warp and die in the overwhelming heat. And at the eye of the storm, the Leviathan stood, unmoved, and scathed. The flames washed over it like ocean waves over obsidian cliffs. Its hide, deep gray veined with otherworldly silver, didn't even blacken. The impact had erased cities in the past. But this time, it barely made the Leviathan blink. Northern, still midcast, stared in breathless silence. Twilight Phoenix had always been his last resort, his nuclear option, the trump card in his deck. And it had done nothing. Not a scratch, not a stagger, not even a growl of pain. Only now did he notice it. A slight tilt of the Leviathan's head, as if acknowledging him, or worse, mocking him. Behind him, firestorms ravaged the forest. The horizon blazed. The very bones of the Academy now crumbled like forgotten parchment in an inferno. And still the monster stood, as if to say, "You will need more than this." Of course, Northern had suspected this would be the case with a Leviathan. He knew what it took to deal with just the hand of one. He had expected the entire body to exert this much resistance. To defeat this Leviathan, he really needed to outdo himself this time. Or just be the same old coward that runs into the embrace of chaos and void. Chapter 994. Beacon of Hope. Of course, Northern did not plan to be a coward. Not today, not in a long time, perhaps not ever. He had steeled himself beyond doubt. He would not resort to chaos and void, even though he faced a Leviathan that would prove nearly impossible to destroy. Still, his gaze burned with determination that seemed foreign to him. Fresh resolve blazed in his eyes, and for some reason, his presence felt magnified against the sky above. The instructors and students scattered throughout the academy's different buildings all stared at the flying boy, and their hearts swelled with flickering hope. Even Alina, working in the smithy, didn't know what was happening beyond the fact that the academy was under attack. The terrible shockwaves hadn't reached them yet, but now she and the other blacksmiths peered into the sky. Though the distance was great, they could still make out the battle unfolding in the air. Its impact echoed across the entire academy, reaching even the non-combative school far from the main entrance. The Leviathan's eyes were dull and dismissive. For a brief moment, the subtle glow within them seemed to die, then slowly began to brighten again. The creature finally stirred. The impact might not have scratched the evil dragon, but it had destroyed the rest of its tentacles. Now that its extended limbs were gone, the monster seemed forced into action. It moved forward on all fours, marching with majestic slowness. Northern hung in the air, floating with hands ready. He had summoned a chain that wrapped around one hand, crackling softly with lightning. The creature moved slowly at first, letting tension settle over the air like a heavy blanket. The whole place felt suffocating, and the molten ground burned deeper with each step. Northern's gaze locked onto the monster with complete focus. No side attractions, no distractions. He studied every subtle movement with intense care, waiting for the monster's first real attack. Despite waiting, he didn't see it coming. From the crimson clouds above, something struck him down. While struck down was the best way to describe it, the thing didn't exactly fall. It simply appeared, or perhaps Northern couldn't perceive it because it happened too fast, faster than he could follow. This terrified him for the first time in his life, because there had been nothing at all that Northern's eyes had missed, and second, he was not protected by void force. The pillar of crimson cloud struck his left side. Though Northern twisted away in time, a chunk of night terror armor along his shoulder and arm was scraped off along with his skin. His muscles lay bare for seconds before blood began pooling from the wound. Even though wicked, devilish pain like he'd never felt before assaulted him, Northern didn't have the luxury to dwell on it. A more pressing pain burrowed into his mind, fear. How did it break through void force so easily? Void force wouldn't stay invincible forever. In fact, when Northern reached the dungeon on this island and started meeting those strange monsters, he began to suspect he needed to prepare for void force's failure against certain foes. He had not just expected to meet that foe this early, and certainly not the creature dwelling in the depth of the crimson cloud. But then again it made sense. Whatever that crimson cloud was had made the dungeon monsters more terrifying and powerful. Even they had nearly torn through void force. It only made sense that the vile thing itself could do so easily. The pillar of crimson cloud that had fallen stirred for a moment, then twisted with blistering speed. But Northern wouldn't let the same thing happen twice. He tore away from the spot, vanishing and reappearing behind the evil dragon's head. However, the creature moved just as fast. Lifting its entire body with speed that mocked its mountainous size, it turned and crushed its head into Northern, right as he appeared, as if it had seen him coming. A circular shockwave exploded outward, followed by a thin streak of light as Northern was hurled through the air like a helpless fired bullet. He burrowed through what remained of the academy's reinforced alloy wall, crashed through hundreds of trees, and even smashed into the mountain behind that led to the hollow, carving a cave through solid rock before emerging on the other side and falling into the hollow that had once been the monster's prison. Northern rolled as he fell. By then, the impact's force had weakened enough for him to control his body again. He rolled midair, changed his path, landed on the depth side, lowered his knees, and blasted into the air, leaving webbed cracks shattering through stone. Northern flew toward the academy almost as fast as he'd been thrown away. Blue flame wrapped around him, streaming off like smoke as he flew with terrible speed. Reaching the melted wall, Northern rolled in the air, folding his knees as he aimed his feet at the creature. The flames exploded with tremendous force, responding to his will, then compressed into his legs as he crashed into the monster with an earth-shattering kick. The academy's ground shook violently. All the buildings seemed to groan with fear before the ground beneath the Leviathan exploded in a spray, a torrent of blue flames that ran wild. Instructors and students fled from both the shattering earth and the stray flames rampaging around them. They ran with desperate speed, sweating from the intense heat, their hearts pounding from the fear of dying as collateral damage. Grown instructors like them reduced to this. The students felt no less terrified, but they had no time for shame. They were either trying to stay alive or still desperately wanting to watch Northern fight the Leviathan. Most importantly, they wanted to know, did the attack hit or not? It had sounded so powerful, the impact traveling deep into the ground before exploding. Northern looked at the blue flames dancing off one of his arms. A frown creased his face. Even Pyreheart was useless. Pyreheart was an ability of Sun Legacy that allowed him to freely control the special heat of his flames. He could reduce it so much that it wouldn't burn at all, yet he could also make it burn the very air itself. He had pushed the heat to maximum, with all the power of his void essence, but it had been completely useless against the Leviathan. The creature had withstood the attack, forcing it to travel into the Earth's crust and explode outward. It stood amidst the remnants of the devastating fire like a demon rising from hell, and Northern stared at it with a blank, thoughtful expression. While still lost in thought, the strangest thing happened. The blue fire, Northern's own fire, bent to the evil dragon's will. Chapter 995. The Force of Will, Part 1. The flames still danced wildly around them, and Northern had planned to use their remnants for another attack while drawing on a different talent. He stretched out his fingers for control, only to notice that the blue flames licking the earth and air refused to bend to his will. A frown creased his brow. The next moment, the flames began pulling together toward a single point. They swirled around the Leviathan, growing as they spun in a perfect circle, picking up speed. The flames pressed together and birthed something far more terrifying. The air itself seemed to melt. Heat waves blurred everything, turning the world into a furnace. The blazing heat reached Northern's open wound. Even as it slowly healed, pain bit deep into his skin. He clenched his fist as blood trickled down his hand. What am I surprised for? It's a Leviathan. He steadied himself, refusing to worry. Maybe he hadn't expected this much, but at the same time he should have expected nothing less. The flames expanded, growing so wide and tall they stretched from the crimson clouds to the ground. A pillar of fire tornado now rushed toward Northern with crushing speed. You seriously think my own ability can harm me? Northern lifted his fingers and snapped. Everything stopped. In the blink of an eye, a towering pillar of frozen storm stood where the fire had been, connecting clouds to earth. It looked as if the heavens had finally built a bridge to descend upon the world. The structure was breathtaking and terrifying, enormous enough to dwarf the academy itself. Snow drifted from its heights, but the ice tower wouldn't last forever. Northern raised one hand and crushed his fist. The tower began crumbling into spikes. Not just spikes, but a storm of jagged ice that immediately tore through the entire area. The academy walls and front compound vanished inside a raging frost storm. White blindness swallowed everything, and the unlucky people caught within couldn't see a damn thing. Vita trembled with fear but stayed put, especially when she watched a massive ice spear rocket past her with deadly speed. Annette didn't need to see such a sight to know better than to move in the blizzard. She understood that Northern fought with full awareness of his surroundings. Others, though, 3 instructors and several students trapped in the storm, tried their best to find a way out, their efforts proving useless. A true blizzard had taken over the academy grounds, making the familiar terrain completely foreign to those caught within it. Northern stood at the storm's heart, his face hard as stone. Blue light blazed in his eyes as he swept one hand around, controlling the blizzard's fury and the speed of ice spears forming within it. Soon, a frown settled on his face. No matter how fast the spears moved, how strong the lances he forged, or how sharp their points, everything shattered against the evil dragon's unbreakable hide. But Northern grasped one thing clearly. The monster couldn't control ice the way it commanded fire. More precisely, it couldn't bend ice to its will with the same overwhelming force it used on flames. Northern raised 2 fingers in front of his face. Ryan had been a master when he absorbed the talent, so Frostheart held just 3 abilities: Ice Manipulation, Absolute Zero, and Frostbound. Of course, he used Ice Manipulation the most. It left endless room for his imagination. Absolute Zero was devastating, and Frostbound was what he'd used to trap the monster when he entered. But it could do far more than that. Combining Absolute Zero and Frostbound, Northern narrowed his eyes to slits, focusing with sharp, biting intensity. This blizzard was his chance to do exactly what he had in mind: to freeze the monster from within. Frostbound was an ice explosion that destroyed enemies either from outside or within. The destruction happened in quick stages, but Northern simply paused at the freezing stage, dwelling only on that part while using ice manipulation to strengthen the freeze. This time, he would push the ability to its limit and use Absolute Zero to boost its power. The blizzard grew stronger. The very air and everyone trapped within it, raging or not, began freezing in place. The effect spread until it reached the center where the evil dragon stood. At that point, everything froze solid. The air, the ground, reaching up into the clouds and freezing parts of them too. What should have followed was an explosion. But the explosion never came. Had the ability failed? Had it exploded without sound? Northern felt the ability activate, but then he felt nothing, as if it had been erased before it could take effect. His eyes grew calm as a red glow brightened from deep within the frozen region. Will! The glow blasted out of the ice. Northern vanished as the straight beam of light tore past the academy, past the island, into the air. For a moment, across the entire Central Plains, people saw what looked like a red light streak forward with incredible speed before dying out in weak blinks. The clouds parted and couldn't flow back where the glow had passed. The frozen blizzard melted as the creature tore through it with a savage cry. The cry drenched the entire academy in sound that tore at their hearts. Everyone, no matter where they were, clutched their ears and bent down in agony. Blood poured from ears and noses. Worse still, the students nearby bled through their ears until they passed out. The instructors struggled to stay conscious. Even Annette and Vita bled from their noses. Northern was the only one floating in the air, hands at his sides, ready for the next attack. His arm and shoulder had fully healed, but the Night Terror armor seemed to be reaching its limit, leaving his shoulder and arms bare. The Leviathan thundered across the ground with speed that shattered the earth and sent cracks spider-webbing through buildings. The very ground bore the brutal weight of its careless charge. Northern braced himself. He didn't run. Instead, a pillar of ice formed in the air, building itself with wild speed. The pillar cast its shadow over the Leviathan's entire body and half the academy. Northern felt the crushing weight of it press against his soul as he held it suspended. The pillar stretched endlessly into the sky, facing the Leviathan charging toward him. With both hands raised, Northern groaned and roared as he sent the massive pillar of ice crashing down against the evil dragon. Chapter 996. The Force of Will, Part 2. Will was a devastating force, an answer to everything Northern had wondered about. He hadn't known much about it before, but he'd always suspected there was something that amplified a drifter's power. A true drifter, paragon and above, he believed. Rizel's last message had given him a clear answer to that silent question. Rizel had also explained, while he was still alive, how a monster's will could influence the world around it, how much it was in their nature to connect with their environment. Back then, they had only faced a behemoth. Yet it had stirred the ocean into a storm through sheer will alone. Now that Northern understood the essence of will more deeply, he was tempted to call that a soul world. But it wasn't. A soul world would work the same for a monster as it did for a human, only more sinister and far more powerful. A Leviathan's will. Northern knew nothing about it, but whatever force it wielded was more than enough to cancel his ability to erase it completely. Northern wasn't sure how it worked, but it felt almost like when he used Chaos Flame to erase things from existence. If he had to guess, the monster wielded its will like a blade, cutting through the very essence that allowed his attack to exist, making it simply not be. To test his theory, he needed to see it again, feel it again, this time with something not as powerful, but so massive that its disappearance couldn't be ignored. The last attack had been hidden within a blizzard, but this one was a descending column of ice that covered the entire sky. From the distant island, it stretched down from within the clouds like one of the pillars that held up the world, falling from the heavens. The moment the pillar struck, time cracked. There was no sound, only silence so deep it swallowed everything. No roar, no howl, no scream, not even breath. Then came the impact. The ice struck the Leviathan with a force that broke the world's natural laws. It didn't merely crash, it descended like the judgment of forgotten gods. The instant it connected, a shockwave burst out in every direction. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then it all froze. The molten earth, once an ocean of glowing veins and dancing flame, turned solid in an instant. Red became white. Lava became crystal. What had been flame-burned and blackened now cracked and shivered beneath the spreading frost. Every flicker of heat died. The scorched battle wounds carved into the academy grounds now glittered with jagged ice. Steam hissed once, then vanished, turning to snow needles mid-air. The Leviathan let out a muffled roar. For a moment it seemed about to stop, slowing down. Then suddenly, the monstrous creature surged forward with crushing force and speed, bulldozing through the frozen ground and charging straight toward Northern. Damn this bastard! Northern braced himself and swung his hand forward. The chains wrapped around his arm lashed outward with vicious speed and force, flying around the Leviathan. Though they seemed small at first, they stretched endlessly like elastic bands, crackling with lightning. As the chains swung over the monster, Northern soared higher into the air, flying in a slanted pattern toward the Leviathan's back. He flew all the way around, then continued toward the sky, heading for the section of wall that still stood, the left edge of the academy. If Northern remembered correctly, that was the depth he'd reached when he first met Professor Heimberger. He scaled the wall at breakneck speed, everything blurring before his eyes. He finally reached its peak, far embedded in the clouds, then flew over it. At this point, the chain seemed to reach its limit. Northern landed on the wall and switched his name for the first time in battle. He switched to Titan's Reckoning. He wrapped the chains around his hands and arms, then applied colossal force and began to pull. The chains stretched taut and groaned horribly. Northern wanted to drag it back toward the wall, maybe crush it through the wall too. Since it seemed strong enough to tear down the academy's wall, it probably had an even stronger hide. If this battle was truly going to end with his victory, Northern needed to stop caring about the people around him. The fact that he constantly measured how much he could do because of the instructors and the academy itself was limiting. If he decided to go all out, everyone would have died already. He honestly didn't know when he'd begun to care, but it was irritating. That's why he was going to move the monster. He thought of using his limitless void, but that was too risky. Besides the fact that hundreds of thousands of people were in there right now, it was dangerous for him to open the doors of his limitless void to any monster, especially a Leviathan. Northern made a tremendous display of might, walking down the academy wall, pulling the chain with grinding effort. The wall beneath Northern's feet groaned as he descended slowly, braced by nothing but will and brutal force. His boots punched shallow craters into the metalwork, every step anchoring him against the impossible weight pulling on the other end of the chain. The air trembled. His arms bulged, thick veins rising like snakes under his skin, glowing faintly with the power of colossal force. His bones creaked audibly, shoulders shaking with strain, and his back bent under invisible pressure. Steam burst from his elbows, his breath coming out like smoke, and still he pulled. The chain snapped taut between him and the Leviathan. It howled with the shriek of metal meeting resistance it had no business enduring. The surrounding clouds warped, bending as though drawn into the tension, and the very air folded inward along the chain's path. Below, the Leviathan lurched. Its feet skidded through the frozen field, tearing rifts in the earth's icy shell. Sparks flew from its claws as they scraped jagged lines across the crystallized ground, digging in, resisting. But it was moving. Chapter 997. The Force of Will, Part 3. Pulling the monster felt like dragging the weight of 10 worlds. But it hadn't started that way. First it moved. Just a few feet. Then a few more. The entire academy shuddered. Statues toppled. The upper floors of the main tower cracked and slid, bowing to some unseen giant. Trees far from the battleground bent sideways, and distant waters sloshed against gravity's pull. Northern let out a roar that wasn't human. It was something ancient, something primal, something that didn't care what lay crushed beneath its feet. The sky darkened as clouds swirled into a whirlpool above him, caught in the orbit of his will. And the Leviathan moved again. A full body length this time. Then two. The monster growled, more irritated than pained. But its limbs splayed awkwardly, unable to find purchase. Tried to rise only to be dragged forward once more. Northern's hands began to bleed. The chains wrapped around his arms started cracking. But that wasn't the real problem. The cracks were still small, and the chain remained strong enough to bear the strain as long as the monster kept moving. But then it stopped. Northern felt it again. The use of will. Now that he was paying attention, he could feel it clearly. It rippled against the world like oil in water. Something that shouldn't exist, yet so obvious that anyone could sense it if they bothered to look. Northern suspected even a master might feel it, though they wouldn't understand what it was. The only reason he could recognize it was because he knew will's true nature. From the behemoth, from witnessing Rizel's soul world, he had learned to understand this raw force. So he recognized it the moment he focused. The Leviathan had issued a command powerful enough to bend reality itself. A command that severed movement. And for a moment, movement became impossible. Even Northern couldn't push forward. No matter how hard he strained. His legs skidded along the same path, moving without advancing. That was what broke the chain. The first crack was small, so tiny it could have been a trick of light. But the second echoed like thunder. Then the entire chain glowed white-hot, as if fighting against reality itself, and shattered. The chain's destruction triggered a backlash so violent it launched Northern skyward like a cannonball. The wall beneath his feet exploded outward in a storm of stone and steel. Chunks of academy wall rained down like meteors. The air cracked. The sky split open. Northern tumbled through the air, flipping wildly. His lacerated arms streamed blood that misted behind him. Sparks from the broken chain still clung to his wrists like glowing spirits, slowly fading. He hit a dome of wind he'd conjured by instinct, landing hard and skidding to a stop. Smoke curled from his shoulders. He coughed, barely able to lift his head, and glared at the Leviathan still pulling itself upright beyond the shattered wall. Despite everything, the beast remained unscathed. But the light in its eyes had changed, burning fiercer now. That eerie calm was gone. Even though it seemed as indestructible as before, it finally looked like the monster it was. And that gave Northern hope. For a moment, he'd almost believed he was fighting something else wearing a monster's skin. Something far more cunning and sinister. But now he was certain it was just a beast. That thought rekindled something inside him. Oh well, shall we then? Northern summoned a mighty gale and blasted into the distance, becoming a blur. He soared over the wall, conjuring another wind above himself to catapult downward. But the Leviathan was ready this time. The monster raised its forelimbs and pushed upward. High above, the clouds began to spiral, as if a storm was about to break. Then pillars of crimson clouds began to fall. They crashed down in quick succession, crushing the earth with force that could rend and shred metal. But there was no effect. Instead, from the depths of the crimson clouds, twisted, monstrous forms began to emerge, rolling forward with terrible speed, hunting everything in their path. The monsters came in different shapes, forms, and sizes, as if all of them had been captured and corrupted. Corruption! The word spiked through Northern's mind as he watched the monsters pour from the pillars, both the flying ones and the crawling ones. Something about these creatures struck him with keen familiarity, reminding him of experiences he tried to forget. Back when he was traveling to Lithia, there had always been something wrong with the monsters he fought. The fact that they were field monsters explained their strength well enough. But there was something essentially wrong about them, something that didn't sit right. And now Northern felt that same wrongness exactly as before. No, this time more vivid, more obvious. And somehow he could tell. So much that he could only ask, with terror creeping across his face. The influence of the crimson cloud. Just how far into the Central Plains has it reached? He had been undermining it all along, thinking it was just the dungeon beneath the academy. But in truth, the crimson cloud had existed for a long time, over 2 centuries in fact. What was to say that the entire Central Plains wasn't already within such a monster's grasp? The thought sent chills racing down his spine. Meanwhile, the corrupted monsters lashed out at people, lunging with crude, widened maws, tearing them apart and dragging them back into the pillars of crimson cloud. For those who fought hard, more monsters rained dough-work on them, and it never got easier, except for the fact that Annette was there. Unlike the tentacles that had left her completely helpless, this was different. She was a force of fire on this battlefield, with an eerie red glow burning in the depths of one eye. She moved cloaked in flames that burned with unforgiving intensity. Monsters scattered and thrashed in her wake, and people were saved. But still, she wasn't enough. There was Vita. Her strikes tore through monster flesh and muscle. Though slower than Annette, she was just as efficient. Northern could almost see Annette's echo in her, the way she moved with terrible strength. Though she lacked Annette's charismatic presence, she seemed foreboding and ominous instead. But she was a strong warrior. Northern continued to observe. Something more about the crimson clouds unsettled him. The eeriness they made him feel, the fact that they seemed to hurt him faster than any blade would, despite his body being somewhat indestructible. He exhaled and watched keenly. What could it be? He dove into his mind for a few seconds, his eyes never wavering from the clouds. Then the stark resemblance suddenly made sense. Northern's eyes widened first, then narrowed. Chaos. Chapter 998. Teamwork, Part 1. It was a rough guess, but Northern couldn't deny what he was feeling. The sensation hit him like a punch to the gut. Strong, familiar, yet twisted into something demented and wrong. Felt like chaos. How? Northern froze mid-air, his mind racing. First, nothing made sense. Then he remembered the sources of chaos he'd absorbed from the Blood King's rift, and the one Byran had recently defeated. The pieces clicked together, forming a picture he didn't want to see. Still, it felt impossible. He wouldn't bet his life on the Crimson Cloud being some corrupted version of chaos. Not yet. He sighed, and suddenly 2 more Northerns appeared beside him. I wonder if I'll survive this time. At the same time, he created 3 more clones in the limitless void. He would have loved to summon 10 more, but he needed to balance his essence recovery with usage. 3 clones already strained that delicate cycle. But what choice did he have? Lives hung in the balance. He had to save the people and defeat the Leviathan somehow. He turned to the clone on his left first. Burning Storm, your job is support. The monster runs hot with fire affinity, so watch yourself. The clone smirked. Northern's own expression mirrored back at him. Don't lecture me, Arse. Besides, fire isn't Burning Storm's real power. You're thinking of his essence manifestation, which you definitely can't unleash yet. Northern's eyes narrowed. Don't count me out. I make miracles happen. The last words came from both Northerns at once. He sighed and looked right. Looks like I still can't handle 3 cleanly. I need to take it slow, or my brain will collapse from overload. He'd never pushed his mind this hard for long stretches. There was no built-up resistance to the crushing weight of enhanced cognition from demon of change and emulation. He faced the Northern on his right. Titan's reckoning now. You handle rescue and cleanup. Whatever you do, stay out of the red fog. And keep close enough to lend me your strength if I need it. The clone nodded silently. Northern had decided to limit himself to controlling 2 bodies with full awareness. Mastering more could wait for a time when the world's fate didn't hang by a thread. He looked at Burning Storm and smiled. You and I are stuck together for a while, buddy. Burning Storm let out a long breath. Yeah, I have to watch your back. It's what Burning Storm would want. Northern flicked his clone's forehead with 1 finger. Shut up and do your job. Then he vanished forward, cutting through the air at incredible speed. His clone followed, matching his pace with deadly grace. Both of them lunged toward the Leviathan with deadly intent. Burning Storm wielded breakneck edge, momentum like a blade. As he neared the beast, the air rippled. Speed became his weapon. An impossible explosion of force shot him forward, leaving the main Northern in his wake. He didn't just fly past Northern. He sharpened momentum to a razor's edge and descended on the creature with a whirlwind spiraling down beside him. A powerful crash rang across the sky. Then darkness swallowed the world. This wasn't ordinary darkness. This was something alien and hungry, a darkness the world had never tasted. Pulsed with terrible power. Combined with what dread and yearning could do, the darkness felt alive, like it wanted to devour everything in sight. Northern plunged his hand forward from behind, just as his clone slammed into the Leviathan. First came a sound like thunder being torn in half, a roar that split the entire sky. The cuts appeared instantly. Northern saw them clearly, deep gashes sliding down the Leviathan's body. Its hide looked like rock soaked in blood for centuries, crude and stained with ancient violence. When the severed pieces hit the ground, the earth cracked and split. The Leviathan barely flinched. Instead, its massive hands rushed forward with speed and power that shouldn't exist together. The blow caught Burning Storm square, launching him backward in a blur. Northern didn't let it shake him. This was the plan: create an opening whether the first strike worked or not. In the darkness that covered the academy, a world of fire suddenly exploded from Northern's hand, setting everything ablaze for 1 brilliant moment. Then all the darkness veiling the sky twisted and flowed, pouring into his hands and merging with the flames. The fire burned fierce and bright, slowly shifting color until it settled into something that looked like purplish-black flames, burning with pure fury. Eclipse dread manifested through what seemed like darkness. But that wasn't its true power. The talent was a channel for dread itself. It took fear and made it real. This was the closest thing Northern had to fighting something as abstract as pure will. The purplish-black flames surged upward with crushing intensity as Northern collided with the monster. Silence claimed the world for 1 heartbeat. Then thunder seemed to fold through the atmosphere. But that wasn't the end. Burning Storm was already coming back. Northern had sent a mental command to Titan's reckoning too. After dropping off a white-haired student who wouldn't stop staring, the clone had vanished and blurred forward like he'd never been there at all. Burning Storm moved with terrible speed. For the few seconds he'd been launched away, he'd done nothing but build momentum, whether from being struck or running in mad circles before charging back toward them. Either way, Momentum Guard had reached one of its sharpest peaks. The speed carried him far beyond what he'd managed while flying. He was still nowhere near light speed, of course. Was it even possible? Northern believed it was. Racing at such speed with momentum building felt like being carried by invisible hands. Amazing and different. If it was possible, he'd surpass light speed one day. Or maybe he already had. No way. This wasn't the time for such thoughts. He flew across the land, hit the ground running, and raced toward the Leviathan's legs. As the attack from above echoed across the entire academy, Northern closed in on both sides of the beast's massive limbs. Chapter 999. Teamwork, Part 2. Boom! The ground shook as the first strike hit home. Another blow followed right after. Titan's reckoning landed first, the impact bouncing back with unnatural force. Something ancient and terrible. Wind burst from the collision, spider-webbing the ground with 1,000 cracks in an instant. The force shattered stone and sent debris chunks flying skyward. The monster's leg buckled, its massive weight shifting off balance. In that split second, Northern, as burning flame, struck with crushing momentum. Just before Burning Storm's attack could connect, Northern crashed down on the beast. Sinister blackish-purple flames roared to life, blazing with pure destruction. The Leviathan moved for the first time. Its folded wings spread wide at lightning speed, covering hundreds of meters in a heartbeat before folding forward like a shield. But the flames were too much. They smashed through, peeling away skin like crumbling stone. At the same moment, another force slammed into its right limb. The creature's entire body shuddered. Without pause, the wind howled and struck with deadly purpose. This wasn't ordinary momentum. Northern attacked with cutting gales. Using his wind control, he mixed Breakneck's edge into the gusts. Burning Storm had to channel it, and both abilities merged, even without sharing the same name. The different names still created limits. Northern could not boost the cutting power by pouring void essence into it right away. But either way, this could work. The wind danced around the Leviathan like a blade, gliding across its surface. Deep cuts tore through what seemed like ancient, unbreakable hide. Northern grinned as wounds opened across its skin, then watched them seal shut just as fast. This wasn't healing. The cuts didn't even bleed before closing. The way they sealed felt like chaos, how chaos rebuilt his own body but faster. Why does this thing feel so much like chaos? What were the odds this monster came from chaos? Any monster could, really. But there was something wrong about this chaos. It felt twisted in every way possible. Then again, shouldn't chaos feel wrong? Or was his own chaos the twisted one? Northern yanked his thoughts back on track. Let's not go down that road. Now that the Leviathan was moving, it seemed even angrier. Its wings hung torn and ragged, pieces falling to the ground in a shower of fragments. Each piece that hit the earth got swallowed by red mist. In the next breath, flying and fast-crawling monsters burst from the haze, joining the fight. None of the Leviathan's body parts were wasted, dead or alive. Northern almost felt like he needed them alive, because dead they just gave the mist more soldiers to create. Burning Storm moved and struck the skin with his fist, but it was like punching solid steel. The beast's hide met him with such resistance that his entire hand shattered in an instant. This shocked him. Just moments ago, the monster's hind limb had buckled under his momentum, and he was still charging with that same force. So how? The answer was clear. The monster had rewritten the rules of its own body. This is going to be rough. Burning Storm believed he could break through whatever rules the monster had changed with its will. A Leviathan might seem deadly and powerful with its terrifying ability to bend reality. But if Northern had to guess, that very power was also their weakness. This wasn't their world, after all. It must take everything they had to mess with the rules of a world that didn't want them here. He nodded. That's right. Burning Storm kept moving and striking. He summoned Illusion Hefter, and even though each strike was useless, like hitting metal with a straw, he didn't stop. The beauty of Burning Storm's ability lay in building up over time. When he mixed momentum that had already peaked without needing to charge with momentum that kept building with every second, even he was curious what would happen. But the evil dragon wasn't going to wait around for them to find out. Its torn wings spread wide like a dark canopy, casting shadows across the land. Then it began to flap hard, slowly lifting its massive body into the sky. The beast opened its mouth as it rose, and a deep orange glow radiated from inside its throat. The two Northerns stood ready. The third one, Titan's Reckoning, had gone back to fighting the smaller monsters and saving people. Holy hell! Northern muttered as the monster's jaw stretched even wider. A thin white beam shot out. Burning Storm raised his hands. The air rippled in front of them as he strengthened it with momentum's guard. But the light beam tore through easily, ripping the momentum apart with savage force. Burning Storm felt the ability snap back into him, making him stumble and cough up blood. Northern didn't have time to react properly. He threw out his own hand, filling the air with void force just as the deadly light beam broke through the momentum coating. A flame powerful enough to tear through momentum that easily would definitely shatter the world if it hit the ground. The whole academy might not survive it. That's why he was fighting so hard to stop it. The light beam pushed forward. Even though void force had stopped it, it kept trying to break through the separated reality and strike the earth. But void force created endless space. No matter how fast the beam was going, it could never. Northern suddenly shook. His eyes went wide as he felt something wrong again. Blood dripped from his nose and mouth. His brow creased into a frown. Soul damage. It felt like the monster's attack had found a way to slice through void force's reality walls, leading straight to limitless void. A brutal assault hit the core of limitless void, sending terrible pain through Northern's soul. Before he could fully understand what was happening, something else tore inside him. He coughed up a spray of blood. In that moment, void force flickered and for the first time ever, vanished completely. The light beam shot through and slammed into the ground with crushing force. Chapter 1000. Fall of the Academy. Boom! The world cracked open. The beam touched the ground and the world overturned. Everything exploded. A shockwave erupted outward in a perfect sphere, vaporizing the ground beneath and peeling away the surface of the entire island like skin being flayed. Buildings, towers, dorms, arenas, even the massive spires of the Grand Library, were ripped from their roots and hurled skyward like feathers caught in a hurricane. The very land shrieked. A wave of force cracked the bedrock beneath the academy, sending it lurching. Fault lines split open like jagged wounds. Hills flattened. Craters bloomed. Forests were torn from the earth. Trees reduced to airborne splinters. The academy's central dome, once a monument to knowledge and power, vanished in a flash of light. Entire sectors were crushed before anyone could even scream. Instructors and students who once stood proud became frantic shadows, fleeing across a collapsing world. Some were incinerated on the spot, their bodies vanishing in white fire. Others were flung like dolls, disappearing into the churning haze of destruction. Monsters, both the crimson ones and the feral beasts that roamed the forest surrounding the island's wide chasm, turned wild with terror. Wings tore through the sky. Tails whipped against falling stones. Screeches filled the air as beasts fought one another in panic or clawed at the walls of reality itself, desperate to escape. A crimson haze, like blood mist, rolled across the broken land. Where it touched life, it twisted it. New abominations were born from corpses, stitched together by the Leviathan's influence. The dead did not rest. They rose, limbs jagged, eyes void-like, pulled back into battle by the mist's command. The sea beyond the island reacted too. Waves rose like mountains around the island, pulled in by the unnatural gravity of the impact. The island's edges collapsed. What was once stable ground began to sink. Entire districts devoured by the churning ocean as the earth groaned beneath the weight of reality's unraveling. From the skies, burning fragments of the shattered defensive towers rained down like meteors, crashing into what little remained of the outer perimeters. Explosions danced in every direction, a symphony of ruin. And in the center of it all, a scar had been carved into the land. A vast, blackened crater hundreds of meters deep and kilometers wide now existed where once stood the heart of the academy. The edges glowed with molten stone. The very air above it shimmered, broken. Heat waves rippled like ghostly hands reaching up to the heavens. Northern, barely upright, felt his body trembling. Void force had never collapsed like that. He had seen destruction before. He had even caused it. But this was annihilation. And the Leviathan wasn't even done. It hovered high above, smoke curling from its torn wings, molten ichor dripping from its jaws. It looked down, not with hunger, not with malice, but with the cold light of judgment. As if this was merely the beginning of what it had come to do. Behind Northern, Burning Storm struggled to his feet, face smeared with blood and ash. Did we just lose everything? Northern didn't answer. He simply stared at the crater and the sea of fire surrounding it. And in the distance, the land kept falling apart. Northern glanced around, trying to find Titan's reckoning, but the clone was nowhere to be seen. Still, Northern was certain he was alive. His clones were strong enough to survive such catastrophe. This was the boon of an SSS-class talent. All his clones were as strong as he was. The only thing that could kill them was running out of essence or damage that could probably kill even him. But everyone else? Northern wasn't sure. Titan's reckoning had been saving some people. Annette and Vita were fine. They had even managed to save certain students amid it all. Nasira was all right too, though she was currently trying to help Shay's leg out from under a large stone. Everyone was scattered around and hidden from view, but Northern could count clearly because of his spatial awareness. He looked at the Leviathan hanging in the sky, brows furrowing. It seems I really underestimated how strong a Leviathan can be. He exhaled slowly, cold air streaming from his mouth. His expression hardened and turned dark. Then he extended his hand, 2 fingers raised before his face. First of all, I'm gonna have to fight you while sealing all your damn abilities. Northern didn't know if Oblivion's mark worked on monsters. He guessed it would work on higher monsters with stronger wills. Lower monsters didn't really fall into its radar because their abilities weren't active. Northern's eyes glowed, and a red light blinked out, quickly spreading across the entire landscape. At that moment, Northern's voice rang out. But it wasn't the same Northern. Titan's reckoning was gathering people to a safe spot at the edge of the crater. As he dropped Elena, who was covered in soot and dust, he looked at them all and spoke. All of you better not try anything stupid. Within 5 kilometers of us right now, I am the only one who can use his talent. None of you can. Annette, having arrived at the safe spot a few seconds ago, frowned. What do you mean? You are the only one. She looked at her palm and tried to summon fire. There was a fragile flame that immediately disappeared. The next time she tried, nothing came. Felt like she couldn't reach her abilities anymore. Her brows furrowed with confusion as she looked at Northern standing before them. Her lips trembled. How? Everyone else was as confused as she was. They tried using their abilities but got no response. Did he really lock down all our abilities? What is that? How is that possible? Please, sir, you need to find my sister. She's not here. Holy stars. Is the world coming to an end? We don't care about our abilities. We are weak anyways. Please just save us. Save us. Rian. Please save us. Save us. Different voices rippled among the crowd. The importance of what Northern was trying to convey quickly fell on deaf ears. All they needed was a savior. I guess the thought of death really makes people desperate. Northern exhaled and spoke through his clone. Anyone who knows someone is missing should speak up as soon as possible. I will make another round and save everyone to the best of my abilities. While that was happening, he was also looking at the Leviathan with a dark and defiant gaze. If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.